Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome my longtime friend, Art Smith. Art is based in Houston. Art, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thanks, Robert.
Now, I'm introducing you, or you're listed on the podcast notes as the author of Something from Nothing, Joe B. Foster and the People Who Built Newfield Exploration. But I also warned you, you're going to have to introduce yourself. So please go.
Okay. Well, I made some notes because it's been a long 70 years. And
you can't read notes. You can't read from the notes. It's illegal. Okay. I'm serious. You can't, no notes. That ruins the whole thing.
All right. I'm a fisherman from New Orleans, Louisiana, who somehow made a wrong turn and went to Wall Street, where I spent 10 years, and then I bought control of a company. I became a principal in a company called John S. Harold Inc. Great little company. We built it from 4 people to 80, and we were approached by IHS Market, whatever they're called now. And we're sold out in 2007, which was right before the market went to heck. And then after that, I've become somewhat semi-retired. I'm on the board of directors of a number of companies, and it's been a wonderful part of my life. And 3 grown children, 5 grandchildren. I tell jokes and I catch fish.
Okay. But your career has been in oil and gas, in researching and investing in oil and gas. That's the punchline here. That is that is the reason why you're on the podcast today. And just to recall, we met now roughly 22 years ago when I was working on my book on Enron, and we've been friends since then. But I wanted to have you on because of obviously your long experience. You were also at First Boston, you were at Oppenheimer, you worked for Argus. You've got your history in the industry goes back, some 40 years now?
40 years, yeah.
40 years. So, well, let's start with the moment today, in the last few days. We're recording this on August 2nd. The huge profits, just staggering numbers coming from Exxon, Chevron, I don't know if Oxy has reported, Conoco. These are big numbers. So I'll ask the obvious and maybe just too obvious question. Why are these companies suddenly out of favor just a few months ago or just making boatloads of cash? Why?
Well, I was talking to a number of friends. Last week was somewhat of a unique one in that we had enormous increase in the value of oil companies, and not just the exploration production group that I know best, but the giant companies,
the super majors.
Yeah, super majors. ExxonMobil was up 11%.
In a week.
Chevron was up 13%. I didn't add it up, but it's multiple billions of dollars went into the area of
market
widows
cap
and
growth.
orphans that own these stocks that have been suffering for a long, long time. So anyway, both of those companies announced earnings. We can talk about that. What they had to say about their earnings in the future is why people are stampeding back into the sector.
And what was that? What was that message? I didn't listen to any of these calls. I just saw the headlines and saw some of the numbers. Why? What is their outlook?
Well, what's somewhat unique is that we're aware that this industry goes through dramatic cycles. Really, really bad cycles. And the one they hit in 2020, which was a combination of pandemic, where the bottom dropped out of the market and the bottom dropped out of margins, and that there was just nothing good. That was an issue because they take quite a while for them to recover from that, and they had to layoffs and things like that. But anyway, since then the market has kind of moved away from the greenness that came along at that same time with Biden and his $1 trillion changes in the carbon world. And the people have become to understand that oil is very important. Oil is what makes the world go round, and what keeps the cars on the road. And so these guys, namely Exxon, Chevron, BP, Royal Dutch, are what grease the skids to make the world a good place today. Energy, as you've said, Robert, poverty is terrible. Energy is needed for growth and and stability.
Yeah. Well, so we've talked about the super majors, but your career at Herald and elsewhere was mainly looking at the independents. So explain that, if you would, just with, the upstream, midstream, downstream. This has been one of the things that, to me, I've understood for years about the oil industry, is that all the money traditionally has been made in the upstream. That is in the drilling part of the business. Is that still true now?
Well, it's an erratic business in that when it's good, it's really, really good. And when it's bad, it's so bad that everybody goes bust. We went through that,
including the midstream guys, because the midstreams, by the way, they're pipeline guys, right? And you're familiar with pipelines.
Tend to hang in there. They're a little bit more. They don't get that profitable, and they don't get that beat up because they're doing a very boring part of the business.
Moving molecules.
Yeah. The excitement in the business, which I've been close to my whole career, is if you are a gambler and you like, the fun times and the excitement, you invest in exploration production companies.
Uh-huh.
The big IOCs, international oil companies, well, they're just sluggish, slow-moving creatures that don't do anything quickly and generally are run by some very boring old men.
Right. And they're integrated across multiple countries, have integrated operations, pipelines, refineries, drilling, offshore, onshore, all of these things together. And that makes them, well, I wouldn't say like banks, but I mean, but still relative to the internet, the super majors, Shell, Total, Exxon, Chevron, Oxy, they're still relatively small or massively small compared to massively small. They're tiny compared to Saudi Aramco, right? Or ADNOC or some of the big national oil companies overseas. Is that still true?
Not really. The scale that you're using, if it's proved reserves of oil and gas, Saudi Aramco is way out there ahead of everyone.
Right.
But again,
and in production, 10 million a day versus what, a million or so for Exxon?
More than that, but let's just say
2 million equivalent or something like that.
Aramco has an enormous amount of reserves, which are mathematically defined by reserve production ratio, number of years you can produce at that reserve. Exxon and others have to continue to replenish reserves and may have RP ratios of 9 to 12 or so. So the issue is the big companies have a challenge to do several things. Most importantly, make money.
Right.
Secondly, with the cash that comes in, figure out what are the potential uses. Well, they're not that exciting. Are they? You're going to either reinvest in so-called maintenance capital. You're going to invest more if you want to growth capital. And then with what's left over, not just left over, the depreciation, other gives you money to distribute money to shareholders and pay dividends. And distributing money to shareholders, I mean, in the case of share repurchases.
Right. And those are considered returns of capital to the equity investors, the share repurchase and dividends. Those are the only ways, right, that you return capital to the
spin-off, maybe.
Oh, okay. Or you could share a spin-off a subsidiary that would just be a standalone company.
Yeah.
Right.
So here's what I think happened last week and why these big companies got legs and started moving. Is that if and I would encourage you to listen to the Darren Woods and the ExxonMobil analyst presentation. But what came through loud and clear was that Exxon, even though incredibly maligned back in 2020, remember what happened?
Oh yeah,
delisted from the Dow. Had a bunch of activists, beat them up and put some people on the board.
Right.
Are viewed as pariahs and unlikely to maintain their dividend, which, by the way, they did maintain their dividend. And their stock got down to, let's say, $30 a share. It's now almost 100.
Right.
So you've had and when it was trading at 30, it had an implied yield of 18%. I don't know, something ridiculous.
And the implied yield, you're talking about the amount of money they were paying out on a quarterly basis in the form of dividends as a percentage of the value of the stock.
Yeah, well, they actually paid 18% out that year.
Right.
Because unlike the other guys, the Royal Dutch, BP, Total, I don't remember which cut dividends in the face of this rough time. Chevron and Exxon rode right through the valley of death and survived. So
and that was remarkable, wasn't it? Because they had to borrow money in some cases to do that, right? To maintain the dividend, right? Which was a big bet on the long-term value of hydrocarbons of all kinds, right? That they were betting that they just said, no, we think this is going to come back, and it sure did. I mean, so why is that? Why is demand so high?
Well, demand is high because, as you've heard so often, we've had low reinvestment throughout the industry. We've gone through this cycle. We'll get back to E&P companies, but the cycle where companies spent money irrationally and too much, and then they stopped. I mean, the market just stopped
with COVID. With COVID in early 2020, yeah. and ESG as well, right? That both of those were the key contributors.
It could not have been the worst concurrence of events that hit at one time. And a man who's been around the oil business his whole life, I got pretty depressed then too. I was looking around, I said, well, this green revolution's coming. These companies are going out of business. They don't have any, but anyway, I don't want you to read the report I wrote at that time, because I was about as dead wrong as I've ever been. And I've been dead wrong more than once.
Well, so you don't hear that much anymore about stranded assets, right? There's this, there's going to be some stranded capital. When I was reading a report from Raymond James, it was really remarkable. It was making a point that, in fact, on a per MMBTU basis now, oil is underpriced relative to natural gas in Europe. That the price of gas is $250 to $300. What is it? $250 to $300 per barrel of oil equivalent. And so that why wouldn't these utilities or whatever burn oil instead of nat gas if they're making electricity? I mean, that's a pretty stunning turnaround given, and there are many factors. We know Russia invasion of Ukraine, but I'll ask this question because it just pops in my head. You've been around and you've seen a fair amount of crazy in 40 years. Is it as upside down now as you've seen it in your career?
The Ukraine issue has really muddied the waters in terms of what is normal. And of course, because of the German decision to go green and rely on Russia for gas, and I think they shut down nuclear too. Just, a very poor portfolio decision making by a country which we consider a fairly smart industrial country.
Right.
So that's triggered this whole issue that we don't have reliance anymore on a major source of energy, gas from Russia, but also oil. So we're in a position here where, unless something happens, dramatic decline in demand, and the story, price elasticity of demand.
Sure.
Gas has got to gasoline $4 or $5. Have people stop driving? No, I don't see any evidence at all.
I don't either.
Maybe a little bit, but that's good. Nothing wrong with that. But anyway, the big thing is that the market is really short energy, very much short new energy supply. And guess who has some growing production? ExxonMobil and Chevron and LNG and Exxon off Guyana, which has been a big investment area for them. Right. And they invested in that right through the downturn, because that's what Exxon does well. Exxon spends its money wisely. It's very, it knows how to do it right.
And well, that's interesting you say that, because those some of those discoveries and the ones offshore Africa are just Guyana. Where I get my geography confused. Guyana's South America, but they've also made huge discoveries and gas discoveries in Africa as well. Mm-hmm. Almost all of it offshore. So I'll ask this question because it just pops in my head. I mean, we talked a long time ago, and I don't know how many years ago, Charlie Maxwell was the talk of the town. There was this idea around peak oil, and if I recall now, I'm not calling you out here, but okay. you were wrong about that too, right? That we were going to run out, and in fact, then the shale revolution happened, and now not only do we have shale, but some of these discoveries offshore have just been enormous. So here's the question. How is it that today, I just looked it up, that the price of gasoline today is roughly the same as it was in 1979, in terms of real terms, about $3.79 a gallon? Why is this is a provocative? Why has oil stayed so cheap for so long? I mean, this really hasn't changed much in 50 years in terms of the real price of the commodity. Why?
Well, you're going back to my previous career at John S. Harrell. We, meaning the company, put out a regular report on what we called oil is cheap. And we would put gasoline over here, and then we'd look milk and Pepsi
right, yeah,
water or whatever it would be. And in almost any comparison, gasoline was cheap, and particularly when you think about what it does for you.
Right.
You don't need Coca-Cola to live, but you may need gasoline to get to your job.
Right.
Anyway, so there's an issue that the reason oil prices, I think, over the long term have remained where they are, and I'm buying into Dan Jurgen, it's technology. The continued improvements in the technology over time, shale being one of them. But what changed the view on peak oil, and I'll be the first to say, dead wrong. I met King Hubbard, thought he was the most brilliant man I'd ever met, had a lot of people that I knew. And King Hubbard's work, if you followed it, was that oil production in the U.S. peaked in 1970 and entered a decline curve that went on for 30 years.
Right.
And what happened? Well, it stopped going down with the shale revolution, first with gas, then with oil. So, and that's what's kind of driving the newfound respect for the oil companies, is that not only can they maintain their current production and financials and things, but they can drive costs down and create enough of a wedge to pay shareholders and pay dividends and do the whole thing. It's like the ideal world. And it happened, I have, again, you said I'm not supposed to consult my notes, but we wrote a whole bunch on this in 2005, 2006, 2007.
About peak oil and King Hubbard.
No, that wasn't as much about peak oil. That was all about the fact that the big companies were swimming in money. They didn't know what to do, and therefore they started paying it out. They started buying shares, paying dividends.
Right.
Basically shrinking the capital float and putting the money in the hands of the investor.
Sure.
And that's my other gripe. I said, this is the big thing I gripe about with the whatever administration and others. They want to teach or direct the oil industry on how to invest its money. And they have various things they could do to invest it.
Right.
But one thing they can't do is they can't tell them to buy, solar this and offshore then and, whatever it may be. The companies have to make the decision as to what is going to give a return. And in this case, BP, Royal Dutch, Total, Equinor kind of bit the green bullet, or green hook, I would call it. And over the last 2 or 3 years, diverted a big chunk of their cash flow away from the traditional oil and gas business. Chevron and Exxon, no, they just said, well, we're fine. We're going to roll ahead. And the guys that did that, yes, about what works in oil companies is you got to spend the money wisely. If you don't spend it wisely, you're going to find there are no returns, and you'll be in the soup with high leverage.
Well, so let me follow up on that, because leverage, the shale revolution, as I understand it and as I've thought about it, it was just amazing for consumers. I mean, the price of gas went down from nat gas from $8 to $2. But in round numbers, wasn't about $300 billion of cash just evaporated by the excessive drilling by the shale? And that is the excessive drilling that didn't return capital to investors during the shale revolution. Is that an approximate number?
It's very apt. I think the .com craziness, what was that, 2000? Yeah. That may have been similar. You just threw money away. You threw it out the window. You were buying this and selling this.
I never thought about it that way. The
the
.com revolution was, or put another way, the
repeated.
shale revolution, or the .com revolution was repeated by the shale gas revolution.
I think so, and it's in the lasting scars in the industry. The exploration production companies is they're about, well, and we keep track. It used to be 100 and something public companies. Maybe it's down to 40. And the 40 that are there have combined all kinds of other private companies to stay afloat.
So they've merged. Mergers and acquisitions have been a big deal. The consolidation of the industry with fewer small independents and into a few super independents. So who would that be? Pioneer on the oil side, EQT
Devon,
on the gas side. So Pioneer.
EOG.
So listen.
Yeah, the top three are Pioneer, EOG, and Devon. Let's just stay with them. If you look at those three companies and what they have been doing and what they're saying, were chastened by the wild characters in Boston, known as the Boston Mafia. And these guys came down in their jets and said, "You guys have destroyed billions of dollars. We're never going to invest in your stocks again. You got to change your ways." And they said, "Well, just so I'm clear, the Boston Mafia, you're talking about Fidelity Investments or I'm talking Fidelity, Kimmeridge. They're all the guys that got a lot of press about the fact that
the big institutional investors that are based in the Boston, and there are a lot of them, right? It's not just Boston, but anyway, but yeah.
Yeah, well, they, after being browbeat and beat up and stock prices, hitting lows and, everything, the pioneers, let's say Scott Sheffield, who I was on his board, brilliant guy, EOG, Devon, all of a sudden they said, well, maybe they're not so crazy. Maybe what we need to do is to concentrate on a fewer number of things, pull in our horns, and be very good at what we do. And after we've maintained production and maybe grown it a little bit, we're going to distribute the rest of the money back to shareholders, back to these guys that lost their money in the previous round. So I think Pioneer's going to pay out, I don't know, $15, $16, maybe more. I don't know the exact number. But anyway, yielding over 10%. And you say, well, oh man, 10%, that's pretty darn good.
It's even higher than inflation.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, that's EOG is the same. Devon's the same. Some of the others are kind of slowly
then Art, with that makes me think, well, then here's the question, which is the perennial question, I guess, is it different this time?
Well, no, it's not. I made you I gave you the thing about 2005. Honestly, I could read you this. It says this was 2007 exactly. I'm sorry to go back to my notes, but it says cash flow management, Exxon style, strategies for reinvestment of cash flows by the International Integrated Oils. And I started off by a quote from Pink Floyd, and from a song called Money. And the quote is, "Money, get back. I'm all right, Jack. Keep your hands off of my stack."
That's
what they're saying. Telling the government,
saying now.
Keep your hands off of my stack. I'm doing a good job with it.
Right. Well, so then what? It sounds like you're bullish on oil and gas, or on hydrocarbons more generally, I suppose. But I've seen comments. I think Mike Wirth, as the CEO of Chevron, said something to the effect, "We expect high prices for a while now." Mm-hmm. So is there enough investment now? You talked about a lack of investment in 2020, 2021. Is there enough money being invested in the upstream now to produce enough liquid hydrocarbons to meet global demand?
I don't think so. But
why not? Why not?
Well, again, because the role that Russian oil has played and will play in the overall market. We've been draining our strategic petroleum reserve at 1 million barrels a day,
right? To
somehow slow down this rampant, run up in wellhead prices. That's not doing it. And then the new supply again is going to trickle back. It's not going to come back but meanwhile, I think there's going to be tremendous surge in the upstream part of the oil and gas business, and in some ways refining and marketing, because of similar situations that, capacity was run down. They closed, plants that weren't successful. So it's a very bullish outlook now.
It's bullish and bullish because there's not enough investment in the drill in the drill bit, that there's not enough drilling going on. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, then the issue is supply demand. That we're at a point where markets seem quite balanced, if anything, underbalanced,
right,
undernourished, and therefore we need every barrel that comes out to keep it going, and therefore prices, the great arbiter, $100 oil doesn't seem like it's got much downside to it and has considerable upside. And so remember, the business runs on not the price of oil, it runs on the margin between the price of oil and the cost of producing it.
Right.
And a big issue that came out, recently said the big companies think not only can they, produce and grow a little bit, but they can continue to drive costs down.
Right.
So that, the oilfield services business has turned on a dime for the same reason. They was starved. I mean, again, I have, close experience that when the bottom dropped out of the oil business in 2020, the oilfield services business went to almost nothing. I mean, to the extent there was any work out there, you were working at substandard or below average price. So you had few people, you had no margin, you had no, nothing. And now today, call up and try and get a generator from Caterpillar, backed up, can't get it, can't get a rig, can't get a pumping unit, can't get anything in the
so when you so when you're talking about the service, so when you're talking about services, you're talking about, well, the truckers obviously moving, frac sand around, but really the drill rigs, in particular AC top drives, right, which are pretty much the standard industry standard now, and also you talk about pressure pumping. These are the frackers, people like Liberty, Oilfield Services, Halliburton, Baker Hughes, the ones who are going to come along and complete the well and bring it in, right, and to bring it into service. So they were getting killed, and now, I've heard that they also have, it's not just the matter of having enough trucks and the rest of them, it's having enough labor that they, especially people who are willing to, work with their hands, work outside, all kinds of temperature, all kinds of weather on extended tours or extended, work periods. And it can pass a drug test, all those things together, right? That they got to be able to pee in a bottle and they got to pass it, right? That these are all constraints on the supply of labor. That's what I've heard. Or what are you hearing?
No, that's you're getting it straight from the source. I would say that the challenge to the oilfield services companies is having laid off 50% or more of their people. Now, within months, they turn it around and want to go back to where they were,
right,
or more.
And can they trick them again? Can they trick them again to believing it's real this time? Is that where you're going?
Oilfield services, in my mind, is the worst sector to ever be an employee, because they throw you out in the bad times. They don't give you any backup, but they will pay you a lot of money.
And then kick you to the curb when they're tired of you.
Right. So there are man camps down around Pecos in the middle of the kind of lower part of the Permian.
The Permian in West Texas. Yeah.
I mean, these things are teeming with people that are working like crazy, making six figures or so, but they're in Pecos.
Right.
And they're sleeping in Pecos, and they're waking up in Pecos.
Working at 60, 70 hours a week and working and living in a mobile home and with a vinyl floor. Yeah.
Yeah. Not living the opulent life that you do on the road.
Yes. Well, I was in the beautiful Embassy Suites in Jonesboro, which was actually pretty nice. Jonesboro, Arkansas. I'd never been in Jonesboro. It's
Motel 6?
Arkansas State. No, Embassy Suites. It was upscale. I liked it. The Arkansas Electric Cooperatives. Okay, well, so since we're talking, we've talked about a number of names. Okay, well, so you've been investing. You're not giving investment advice here, and you make the usual disclaimers. So, what companies do you like? Or let me ask you this way first: what investment classes? I mean, you've been investing and looking at research in all kinds of asset classes for 40 years. I'm not convinced on Bitcoin. Gold has done nothing. I'm always suspicious of the oil and gas industry because it's so cyclical. You know, what makes, you know, I invest in index funds, right? I finally I finally figured out I can't outsmart the market. What do you think makes sense in the given where the world is these days?
Well, first of all, like anyone else, I struggle with my own personal portfolio and what to do with it. I do have a recent experience where the outfit that's been managing most of my money doing a very fine job, had a large chunk of my portfolio in municipal bonds, which were yielding 2.5%, whatever.
Right.
And they were down 12% or 15%. And I said, this makes no sense to me. Sell all those, send me the money, and I've invested it in what I know: integrated oils, E&P, service companies that I know, and a variety of other things too, just to mix it up with an NVIDIA and Amazon or whatever, Home Depot, I don't know. But anyway, the overall thing is, if I own Pioneer and they're paying out over 11% in dividends, while in this very uncertain market that everyone knows well, it could get a lot worse. It could get a lot worse. My view is, well, I'm going to get 11%. Stock can go down 11%. I'm still okay. I'm not, you put me in those bonds, 2.5% yielding bonds and a rising inflationary, I mean, I've looked at the yield curve too. When interest rates go up, value of the bonds goes down. So,
right.
Anyway,
so you want to own something that pays you cash?
I like cash. And I think if I was going to pick up one, that Warren Buffett doesn't buy bonds. He's a believer in companies that produce dividends
over the long term, and he's big. He's got a huge position now.
Bonds are for wimps.
He's the biggest holder now in Occidental Petroleum, right? He's super long Oxy.
He is, which by the way hasn't been performing as well as Exxon. But anyway, but he didn't call me up and ask for advice.
Well, I'm sure he will. I'll call him. I'll tell him to call you.
Yeah. Omaha, give me the Omaha line.
Yeah, that's right. So you like Pioneer, is what I've heard you say. Anything else now? Since I don't know, what you need to. I don't think there are any disclosure rules on a podcast. You can say whatever the hell you want. So you to go ahead.
Ones I mentioned to you already. Pioneer, EOG is just a fabulous company in the same area. Devon is a fabulous company in the same area.
And EOG, we have to mention, EOG was Enron Oil and Gas. Exactly. Now known as EOG Resources, was sold off under the Kinley and Jeff Skilling era because they were going asset light. And they didn't want to mess around with this old-fashioned drilling company that actually made money and produced the products that they moved into their pipeline. So they spun it off. And EOG is still around, and Enron ain't.
Yeah, well, man, we started talking about Joe Foster, but EOG had a unbelievably dynamic CEO by the name of Forrest Hoagland.
Oh, right.
And Forrest Hoagland, when he saw this, asset light stuff, got a deal to sell off part of their assets and buy back the stock and get out of Dodge when it came to Enron.
Right.
And it's developed in probably, like Pioneer, become a $50 billion, maybe more.
Right. Well, let's talk about Joe B. Foster, because that's how I've identified you as the author of this book, Something from Nothing. That book was out now, 10 years ago or more?
It's about 10 years, I think.
Right. And who bought Newfield? Foster built up Newfield, and then Newfield was purchased. Who bought them?
It was Encana, which is
now Oventive. Yes.
Yeah. Which I'm still shaking my head, whatever the hell an Oventive is. Anyway, that was unfortunate, but Newfield kind of ran out of steam there, and the executives got tired and decided to hang them up.
Well, let me ask about that, because you've written a book about Foster and this, his ability to grow the company, and it's one of the things that you're familiar with over your career, and what makes. Well, I'll ask the question directly. So, you profiled Foster and learned a lot about him and his management team, and you mentioned, Forrest Hoagland. We've talked about other CEOs. What makes a good what separates the good oil and gas executive from one who fails? What is there some quality that they have? Is there something that they have that's different? Or is it how much is luck and how much is really skill?
Well, it would take quite a bit of time for me to give you all the attributes of Joe Foster, because Joe
Okay.
Foster had so many. I mean, but down deep, he was a good man. He enjoyed honest day's work. He had good people around him, and he generally was a problem solver. You know, he went to Texas A&M. He became a superstar um, engineer, petroleum engineer. Then he goes to Tenneco, rises right to the very top of Tenneco, and the chairman decides that they want to pay the dividend and they're going to sell the oil and gas company. So at 50 something, he's out on the street with some money. And instead of giving up like most would do, he starts a new company with $9 million and a whole bunch of people who cared and with their own money in the deal. And anyway, the story thereafter is just a reinvestment. We talked about before. Took a dollar, put it in exploration some, put it in development some, and turned a dollar into $2, and $2 into $4. And the track record was decreasing net worth of the business over time, volumes, margins, and good decisions.
And so, well, how much of it is? So it's that. It's trust, charisma, all those things together. I heard one headhunter. He was. I asked him about, well, when you're looking to hire somebody, what is it that you see, or what is it that you're looking for? And I remember what he said. He said, well, there's the eye of the eagle. He just had, that was the line that he used about. There's a certain attitude about knowing what one person, their qualities, and that they're going to be good leaders. Does that rhyme with you? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, well, you know, I've been part of a good chunk of the book about Joe is about the people and how he brought in and recruited and brought into the fold David Trice and I don't know, Waldrop and all the guys.
But they believed in him. They bought into his. They trusted him.
But they bought into him. But they also were independent thinkers. They didn't say, Joe, this is the way it ought to be. I don't agree with you. They would fight it out over an idea until they came to a group view that was a good decision. And in those decisions again, it worked because you had some people that are, the classic, that get on the bus and they know where your destination is. And if they don't like the destination on the bus, you get them off.
Right. It's interesting what you said. It just popped in my head when you were talking about this idea of criticism and so on, that it was a discussion of militaries and whether, which ones are successful, and that the U.S. military has had this record of success in part because there's a sense of ability of, well, the leadership has to listen to criticism, right? That this is the way you make the system better, and your feelings might get hurt, but you have to be able to criticize leadership and let them and work through the process. Whereas in some militaries, and I'm not going to name them here, I don't know that, but there's a sense of humiliation. You wouldn't dare disagree with the leader, the who's your superior, because that would cause them to lose face, and that the requirement was, I hear you're saying it, is that there has to be a culture in which disagreement is not, it's okay, and that their criticism and is seeking that proper end is a key part of the part of the strategy, or part of the culture, I guess, is what I'm trying to get to. Is that fair?
Again, I ran a company for 20 something years, and it was all about building it around good people who liked working together, who saw things generally the same, but disagreements were not unusual. And to dig into the cliche thing, I'd say, good. What is it?
No good deed goes unpunished.
No. Said, good judgment comes from experience, but experience comes from bad judgment.
Okay.
You gotta let people make mistakes. You got to make mistakes yourself. You got to take chances. I think in the case of Newfield, that's what they did. They took some pretty bold steps, but and they did very, very well until the company kind of ran out of energy. And
Right.
anyway.
Well, and isn't that part of the remarkable story of Exxon is that, and I've joked, don't short Exxon, right? Because they just
Right.
seem like
No.
this is a company you don't want to bet them short because they just seem like they just keep on keeping on. But that has required a tremendous amount of cultural discipline. And there's criticism about Exxon that it's kind of like, it's not an oil company, it's a cult, right? You know, that the people get in there and they just don't leave and they'll stay 30 years and that's it, right? But that it's a rather insular culture, but incredible, has been in the history of American business remarkably successful over a very long time.
Yeah, well, they start off with bright people. A lot of them are engineers, chemical engineers in particular. You know, Netherlands Sewell, the reservoir engineer company, is entirely composed of ExxonMobil people.
Is that right?
You can look at their resume. Oh, apparently, if you're an ExxonMobil guy and you know petroleum engineering, you might want to go over here to Netherlands Sewell. But anyway,
and is that a Houston-based company? I don't know that company.
The Dallas-based.
Dallas-based. Well, let me ask you. So I'll interrupt here. So let me ask you about Houston, because we met when I was, as I said, doing interviews for Pipe Dreams, which is my first book.
Wow. And a great book it was.
Well, thank you kindly. One of 6. Buy them all. Make sure. Here's the latest one. Question of Power. You don't have to read it. You just have to buy it. That's and buy it on your Kindle. I make a better royalty. When did you go to Houston? What year did you move to Houston?
1998.
And so now that's 24 years ago, right?
Yeah.
How's it changed? Has it changed?
Houston is a vibrant economy. Obviously, when I came there, I had left the Connecticut office with the idea being, and I would help build up the presence in Texas, and it all worked out. I met people, and I've got a tremendous connection of friends and family and business associates, and it's an energy town. I mean, there's no doubt about it that even in the worst of times, it's still got CEOs, in every major restaurant, and you can't get away from it. So but again, you're an Austin guy, but that's because you like the weird. We just like the successful.
That's funny. But New Orleans, you said at the beginning, New Orleans is your hometown.
I love New Orleans. Get back to New Orleans.
But is that that's where you're from? I didn't know your family was from there.
Yeah, my mom's family, my dad's family, all my cousins.
Okay.
I get back pretty regularly. No, I love New Orleans, and I think I told you I'm working on the book about excursion steamboats in the Mississippi. It's just a great. New Orleans is tiny though. It's a little town compared to Houston. Is just a monster.
Yeah, no, it is not. And I was just there in March. I actually spoke at American. What do they call the petrochemical refiners? Is that the name of a huge meeting? Ian Bremmer spoke as well. At that meeting, it was just a huge number of people. But I didn't realize it until I walked around. It's also one of the poorest cities in America. I mean, the major cities in America. The poverty there is remarkable. I mean, especially just near the Superdome. Just incredible.
Yeah, but there's also the Mardi Gras.
Yes, and which I've never been to, but let me go back to Houston. So we met talking about Enron back then, and you had gone to some of these analyst meetings with Skilling and so on. What effect did Enron, the collapse of Enron, have on Houston, and what have there been enduring effects, and if so, how, and if so, what?
No, the answer was other than the fact that Enron had collected a lot of very smart people who are very ambitious, and these when it came apart, tremendous number of people split off for other areas. It's the after the forest fire, the seedlings kind of come up from the bottom, and so I think that it may have sparked the beginning of the revival of why Houston came back so quickly. And Houston will bounce back quicker than most. I mean, it's just I said anywhere, you don't like your house, just knock it down. We'll put another one in. The restaurant over here, well, I close that. We're going to open another one. So it tends to be a very vibrant that way.
I think that's interesting. I love Houston. I've always had just great experiences there. And writing the book, I mean, people are very, very friendly. There's an old line about anybody in Houston will have lunch with you once. I'm not sure if that's exactly true, but the dispersion of talent after Enron is, that you can go throughout the different energy sectors. And Jim Hughes is at Jupiter Power, I mean, for instance, and then the EOG, and then I run into people who are former Enron all the time, right? Or knew somebody, or had family, or you name it. So the effect on Houston was kind of a rebirth, a recharge then, with other people going out and starting new businesses or joining existing, Rich Kinder being one of them then, and to become the pipeline magnate would be the most obvious example, right?
Yeah, absolutely. My partner for a number of years, Gabe Chavez, came out of Enron Trading, or Enron something or other, and a very bright guy. So, he bounced back very well.
Or John Arnold, the other one now, the billionaire who was a former Enron guy and now is in philanthropy, right? He was a trader and made not a zillion. He made a very large amount of money,
just short of gazillion,
using the skills he learned at Enron. So the city, in some ways, is still not necessarily defined by Enron, but this is just one of the other examples of how the city revitalizes itself, or just that it gets reborn with different people and different companies.
Yeah. Well, don't forget, Bill Gilmer, who's now over at the University of Houston, was the economist with the Federal Reserve Bank and the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, Houston division. And he wrote extensively about the shift in people around the booms and busts of the oil business. And it's the classic that, when things got really bad, people shut down Midland, they shut down Pegasus, they shut down Amarillo, and they all came to Houston.
Right.
And then these companies got around, and as they got up and got going, and private equity played a huge role in getting these new companies going. But when they started doing better, well, you know what? They moved back to Midland. I mean, it's a good example that, saying that you can't get people to move to Midland, but you can't, once they're there, you can't get them to leave. So it's apparently, I mean, I say that because Houston will pull it all in when things are tough, and then it will disperse
with the cycle,
with money.
Yeah, with money, with the cycle. Well, let me ask you about that private capital, because I'm glad you brought that up, because I interviewed Joe Kraft, who's a coal guy, on the podcast a few months ago now. He's a Tulsa-based guy. I'm from Tulsa. His company's Alliance Resource Partners. They're the second largest coal miners on the East Coast, or on the Eastern U.S. And 7 of his 14 banks were in a revolving credit line pulled out because of ESG. And I've heard the same in terms of capital availability in the oil patch. And I see you shaking your head. So are there real capital constraints on the drillers? Is this one of the reasons why you think we're going to see higher oil prices longer? Is that there's less capital available, and if from the traditional banks and lenders, and now in the second part of that are the private capital, like the end caps or the other private equity firms, are they the ones who are stepping into the breach here in where the banks used to be?
Well, but first of all, you said, is there any money available in the traditional reserve-based lending area? Are you kidding me? No, there's no RBL lending. Everybody's getting squeezed down. If you got money, just pay it back.
Okay, so I just want to stop you there, because I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. This traditional reserve-based lending. So if I've got 5 drilling rigs and I've got 100 prospects, and I can say, well, these wells,
and I have reserves.
I have these reserves, and they're this many barrels, and I think I can produce this many barrels, and therefore give me a loan for this amount. That's gone. That was a traditional model of financing for drillers, and that option is no longer no longer available. Is that? Am I reading you right?
That's correct. That's correct. Burned was the last cycle. And oilfield services double that. It's just really been bad.
And so the bankers say, yeah, we've seen this movie. We didn't like it the first time, so go somewhere else.
And we've been trying to get out of these loans. Now that the company's starting to make money, and I happen to have an inside connection here, there are new bank groups coming in. There will be a new, switch over. Private equity is the best thing that the oil industry can look forward to, because that's where the true entrepreneurs can start and build big companies. I mean, it's just, I've been around for so many years. I've seen some phenomenal, this Matador being a good example.
What is that? I'm sorry. What is Matador?
Matador Resources out of Dallas. Probably invested in that 20 years ago at a $2 stock. It's a $60 stock. It's producing 100,000 barrels a day. Wow. It's got good people. I mean, they're just all these. There's been a lot of problems along the way. But you mentioned NCAP. I saw Marty Phillips, one of the principals, just last week, and he said they're girding up to go back into the market with a new fund. And even though the last one was $7 billion, they'd be happy to get $3.5 billion. Well, $3.5 billion doesn't sound too bad, but I mean, they had been one of the most productive for new companies, and then in the downturn they had to smash them together. So many of the companies were recapitalized or so. But the cycle's turned over. The cycle has changed.
And that capital availability, then what I hear you saying is going to constrain the amount of drilling because there's just not as much money available. Is that going to, or are high prices going to cure high prices? I mean, that's always the old saw, but if there's not enough money to do the amount of drilling needed just for replacement of crude production, does that then, recessions, of course, and supply destruction are always possible, but we're seeing longer term constraints on capital. Is that a fair way to put it?
Absolutely. Well, if you're going to, if you want to put together a business model or business plan, Robert, and say, I'm going to go in and meet the guys and say, here's what we're going to do. We got a group of 20 people. We've done geologic, we've done geophysical, we have engineers and things like that. All right. So how much you want? $100 million. What are you going to do with it? Well, in the most recent past, the answer was, we're going to make an acquisition. We're going to acquire somebody else's assets that aren't working quite as well, that they're casting off. And then we're going to use that to build a base around which we grow or so. This time, first of all, there aren't that many deals that haven't been done that were probably should have been done. And I have to think that the exploration model, which has long been under the gun, is going to be hard to sell again, because their exploration is still like going to the roulette table or whatever you want to call it.
But you're talking about wildcatting, whereas as my understanding is a lot of the geologic risk with shale has been taken away, right? That there's not that much more risk. So what are the risks? Are they technology risks? Are they equipment risk? Is it mostly capital risk? Where is the risk in the business model then?
Well, the risk is in the change, I would say, is that you have existing places where they thought they had it all figured out. Let's say the Eagle Ford, let's say the Haynesville, the Austin Chalk, all the way up to Denver, Julesburg, and Powder River. Hey, there's a lot of America out there that hasn't been drilled. I don't know what the next one is, but somebody else is looking for it, just the way they did when the shale deal opened up.
So you're saying the quest then has to.
They're out there. They're out there, and they want your money.
So you're saying that there needs to be another shale? They need another formation, then another frontier formation. Is that's
formation, a technique, an ability to get more out of it. I mean, all the new oil field services using local natural gas supplies to rather than diesel, and there's a lot of. I mean, the technology just doesn't stop getting better.
Well, and I think that's a key point, because we hear this over and over about particularly the renewables. Oh, the solar panel is going to be this much more efficient, and this wind turbine, we're going to make it, even taller so more people will be able to see it, and then therefore they won't want it. But it's much more efficient, and all forgetting the amount of momentum and capital behind the oil and gas industry and the constraints on those capital that are forcing efficiencies to produce more molecules with the same drill rig, same pipe, same all of this, right? They're getting more out of each dollar invested. The scale of what's happened in the oil and gas industry seems to me to be or the change in overall productivity has been far greater in oil and gas than it has in anything else.
In part because they had to. I mean,
That's a good point.
My involvement with being on an exploration production company board in the production and the natural gas in the Rockies, actually, was that when it was in a deal, it was put together by private equity, Yorktown. The company was acquired and was, viewed as, unnecessary by the prior owner. And the company started, fixing up 200,000 acres of this play, and the prices kept going down. And they, basically the only way they stayed in business was by driving their costs down,
right?
Which was driving people costs, every cost you can think of, and then and staying alive because of hedging. You know about hedging, so,
right? Yeah.
So they hedged almost all the production at $2. Well, the market takes off now, and we're selling our gas at $2
instead of $8, which is a pretty painful thing.
Yeah, the only way we can make money is to produce new gas that's it's coming from different formations, or refracts, as they're called. And
so what I hear you saying, though,
at $8 a million BTUs, it sure makes a difference in terms of the profitability of the business.
Sure.
The business goes from being just hanging on by a thread to being a very interesting growth business.
Right. Well, and so what I've heard you say, and I put it, maybe I'm paraphrasing, but the oil industry had to get more efficient if it was going to survive. That's been and I guess we've talked about that in different ways this whole hour so far, right? That this has been the story of the survival of reducing costs, increasing production throughout every part of the value chain, I guess, to
right.
use.
And that was the Joe B. Foster model when he first started Newfield.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't know if it was a good time to do anything, but he knew there were a lot of opportunities to be right, to make things happen.
Right.
But the fundamentals were dismal.
Right.
Anyway, he made it work.
Well, so I want to return to this, and I know, at the risk of saying, well, you're just talking your own book, and I'm making that inference, but I just was, you said you invested in what you know, right? And you've been in the oil and gas, but I mean, it just seems today that when it comes to any asset class, it all just seems weird. I mean, and maybe that's why oil and gas suddenly is having this, this second run, or this yet another in the many cycles of oil and gas suddenly being good, suddenly being bad. But that it just, I'll ask the question this way: in modern times, in the last 10 or even 20 years, has the asset classes, the commodities, been as volatile as they've been in the last 3 or 4? I mean, because it just seems copper was going toward the moon, suddenly copper falls. Yeah. Bitcoin was going to be the next thing, then Bitcoin falls apart. Gold doesn't do anything. It just seems like the world, the economic system as a whole is just being rocked, and there's not much sensibility or even faith in it, I guess would be another way to am I overseeing this or overstating this?
No, you bring me back to an observation that goes back to very early in my career, when I became an oil analyst in the mid 70s, because the oil industry was just flat boring. Nothing was happening. Oil prices had moved up from $3 and then eventually, but come 78, 79 and the fall of, Shah of Iran, prices soared. And all of a sudden oil went from being totally out of favor to being the only thing in favor. And the sector, mark me if I've got the right numbers, the pie became 25% oil, and oil service and oil coal and blah, blah, blah. And everything else shrunk. Everything else. Like, money was pulled out of other industries to feed the oil industry. Well, great over capitalized and overdone. Then the peaks in the early 80s, and it begins this long slide that hits, let's say, 10 years ago. The oil sector was probably 8%, let's say,
of the Dow. Now you're talking about the Dow, the Dow Jones Industrial Index.
Yes, yeah, whatever we call it, the pie of where the capital is.
Right.
And where does it hit in 2020? 2.5%. So you went from being 10%. You went from being something that was meaningful to being a cast off. Well, you know what? It's back to 4.5%. Feeling a lot better about life.
Right. Well, it reminds me what you said there. It's just what Art Berman, who you probably are familiar with,
I know Berman, yeah.
Oil economist. His line is, "Oil is the economy." He said, he also says energy is the economy. But is that what we're learning now? I mean, is this a lesson that's being relearned, that these ideas around alternatives, the energy transition, we're going to go to electric vehicles, all this other stuff, like you referenced earlier? I've been flying a lot. Flew yesterday. I'm flying again in a couple of weeks. People are in airports are crowded. The highways are crowded. The
Yes.
truck stops. Buc-ee's is booming. I was in Buc-ee's in Madisonville, Texas last week. Man, was it mobbed. I mean, just there are people everywhere buying deep beef jerky. And that. So is this a lesson we're just going to have to keep relearning, that oil is the economy? There is no replacement. Get over it. And this is the way it's going to be for a while.
Well, listen. My career's already gone for quite a while. I don't know where we're going. I don't know where we're going from here. But I would say, in at least the 5 years that I kind of pay attention to, going out, yeah, I think oil is going to be very important. I think there's going to be a rebalancing view that we can have a world economy that exists that doesn't have to immediately switch to low carbon. Deep sequestration and all the.
It can't. Isn't that it? It just can't. The physics of it. You can't make a switch that quickly.
Yeah. Well, you've written about it, and I follow all that. The issue is these expectations of zero carbon, balance and all that are just so off the wall, unrealistic. But as far as where it goes from here, King Hubbard said solar. And and I'll go. Hey, who's going to argue with the sun?
Well, okay, so that's interesting. If you're willing to make your supply chain, at least for the moment, dependent on China with polysilicon and the rest of it, but the same with rare earth elements for wind turbines and EVs. But that's a whole separate discussion. Well, we've been talking for roughly an hour here, Art, so I don't want to keep you too much longer.
It's cocktail hour.
Yes, well, it's getting there. Yes, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. So, so what are you reading? I know you're doing a lot of fishing. You've got family duties. You're incredibly busy for a lot of the times. You have books that you're reading now? I know you're reading some of your old writing, but what's got your attention on the bookshelf?
I read the bio of Benjamin Franklin. That was quite good.
Oh, the Walter Isaacson, that one?
Yeah,
the one that just came out? Yeah.
That's a great book. It also taught me a lot about what I didn't know about Franklin and the world at the time and everything.
He's an incredibly interesting guy.
Goodness. He was a scientist and he was a poet and he was everything else. Anyway, that's probably the one that I've reached out from a little bit. Everything else I've been reading recently has to do with the steamboats on the Mississippi deal that I've been, the book I've been working on.
Oh, right.
And that's
tell us about this.
I'm plugging my book.
No, that's good. I've seen, I was in Houston a while back and we looked at some of the photos and so on. Just give us the brief rundown on the book that you're now finishing and that you're going to be publishing here in the next few months. Give us the title right. and the jacket copy. We've talked about this. Give us the very brief pitch.
Right. Well, the working title right now is Jazz and the
Big Smoke Canoe.
Big Smoke Canoe. I don't know why. But anyway,
it's your book. It's your book. I'm gonna help you out here. The Jazz and the Big Smoke Canoe, which is about your family's history in the steamboat business on the Mississippi River.
Yeah, a big smoke canoe was a term that the Native Americans used to define steamboats when they first came on the river. Uh-huh. And my great grandfather was key in implementing what was at the time called excursion steamers when they moved from being packet steamers, which were people and goods, to only people. And in the people area, in 1900, he built the first purposed boat called the JS, named after himself. And he made a dance floor, music. And then from there, he and his sons, developed and created a business around there where they were over all the way from New Orleans to Minneapolis, St. Paul, up to Pittsburgh, and had all these boats going, including probably the most famous one was the Admiral out of St. Louis. That was basically an ocean freighter of sorts. It was 310 feet by 90 feet and could hold 2,000 people on the dance floor. And the jazz came in when the family hired Fate Marable, and he hired all these guys, including Louis Armstrong. So the boats moved up and down the Mississippi, and they introduced all the port towns and everyone else to jazz, or what was emerging jazz.
Right. Well, that's great. It is an interesting story, and your family connection there is quite intriguing as well. So I'll definitely be on the lookout for that. So the last question, Art, you've been on the podcast. Well, you haven't been on the podcast, but I think you've listened to it before. Well, so what gives you hope? What makes you optimistic in a time where there's a lot of upheaval, a lot of uncertainty in a lot of different areas? What makes you optimistic?
Well, there are very many things, Robert, but I would say the most is the fact that there is such a greater feeling of transparency and change, and some of the work that you're doing and others, that we know energy is an issue for us, the world, and we know that carbon and change like that are issues, but there's tremendous amount of talent and capital and energy being directed. So I think we're going to fix things. I don't think it's going to be just craziness as we've had recently. I have to say, our president said that Exxon has more money than God, and I'm saying, I'm sorry, President Biden, you have more money than God. It's just that you don't spend it as well as Exxon.
And he might have gotten the companies wrong. Apple has more money than God. What was
too.
What did I see that thing the other day? There was criticism about the oil companies doing buybacks, and I think Apple's buybacks were, leaving the oil companies.
But there's a good example. They know what they're doing with their money, and they're not wasting it.
Right. Well, listen, this has been great fun to catch up, Art. We've been friends a long time, and great to be able to talk about some of these things and let other people eavesdrop, because we've had many of these conversations about the markets and Enron and Houston and so on over the last many years. So my friend Art Smith, he's the author of Something from Nothing, Joe B. Foster and the People Who Built Newfield Exploration. He's also the president of Triple Double Advisors. That's a Houston-based energy consulting and investment firm. You can look him up there on tripledoubleadvisors.com.
Triple Double Advisors.
Yeah. So Art, thanks again for being on the Power Hungry podcast. It was great fun.
Thank you, Robert. Come on down to Galveston and look at some of the birds we have down there. We have a wonderful wildlife refuge near my house.
Oh yeah, no, I that's a good invitation. I'll definitely take you up on it. Well, thanks to all of you. Thanks, Art, for being on the podcast, and thanks to all of you in podcast land for tuning in. And make sure to tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. See ya.